At sight of the device, the witch seemed struck with panic, and her grip relaxed long enough to give Gilman a chance to break it entirely. He pulled the steel-like claws from his neck and would have dragged the beldame over the edge of the gulf, had not the claws received a fresh access of strength and closed in again. This time he resolved to reply in kind, and his own hands reached out for the creature's throat. Before she saw what he was doing, he had the chain of the crucifix twisted about her neck, and a moment later he had tightened it enough to cut off her breath. During her last struggle, he felt something bite at his ankle, and saw that Brown Jenkin had come to her aid. With one savage kick, he sent the morbidity over the edge of the gulf, and heard it whimper on some level far below. Some beings try to promote psychosomatic harm to oneself, or perhaps not psychosomatic, but, you're convinced it's coming in somewhere else. Whether he had killed the ancient crone, he did not know, but he let her rest on the floor where she had fallen. Then, as he turned away, he saw on the table a sight which nearly snapped the last thread of his reason. Brown Jenkin, tough of sinew, and with 4 tiny hands of demoniac dexterity, had been busy, while the witch was throttling him, and his efforts had been in vain. What he had prevented the knife from doing to the victim's chest, the yellow fangs of the furry blasphemy had done to her wrist, and the bowl so lately on the floor stood full beside the small, lifeless body. In his dream delirium, Gilman heard the hellish alien rhythm chant of the Sabbath coming from an infinite distance, and knew the black man must be there. Confused memories mixed themselves with his mathematics, and he believed his subconscious mind held the angles which he needed to guide him back to the normal world alone and unaided for the first time. He felt sure he was in the immemorially sealed loft above his own room. But whether he could ever escape through the slanting floor or the long-sloped egress, he doubted greatly. Besides, would not an escape from a dream loft bring him merely into a dream house, an abnormal projection of the actual place he sought? He was wholly bewildered as to the relation betwixt dream and reality in all his experiences. The passage through the vague abysses would be frightful, for the Walpurgis rhythm would be vibrating, and at last he would have to hear that hitherto veiled, cosmic pulsing, which he so mortally dreaded. Even now he could detect a low, monstrous shaking, whose tempo he suspected all too well. At Sabbath time, it always mounted and reached through to the worlds to summon the initiate to nameless rites. Half the chants of the Sabbath were patterned on this faintly overheard pulsing, which no earthly ear could endure in its unveiled spatial fullness. Gilman wondered, too, whether he could trust his instincts to take him back to the right part of space. How could he be sure he would not land on that green Lytton hillside of a far planet, on the tessellated terrace above the city of tentacled monsters, somewhere beyond the galaxy, or in the spiral black vortices of the ultimate void of chaos, where reigns the mindless demon Sultan Azathoth? Just before he made the plunge, the violet light went out and left him in utter blackness. The witch, old Kezia, Nahab, that must have meant her death, and mixed with the distant chant of the Sabbath, and the whimpers of Brown Jenkin in the gulf below, he thought he heard another and wilder whine from unknown depths. Joe Mazurwick's the prayers against the crawling chaos now turning to an inexplicably triumphant shriek world of sardonic actuality, impining on vortices, a febrile dream. Iya, Shub Niggurath, the goat with 1,000 young. They found Gilman on the floor of his queerly angled old garret room long before the dawn, for the terrible cry had brought Destrokers and Choinsky and Dombrowski and Mazurwicz's at once, and had even wakened the soundly sleeping Elwood in his chair. He was alive and with open, staring eyes, but seemed largely unconscious. On his throat were the marks of murderous hands, and on his left ankle was a distressing rat bite. His clothing was badly rumpled, and Joe's crucifix was missing. Elwood trembled, afraid to even speculate what new form his friend's sleeping waking had taken. Mazurwicz's seemed half dazed because of a sign he said he had in response to his prayers, and he crossed himself frantically when the squealing and whimpering of a rat sounded from beyond the slanting partition. When the dreamer was settled on his couch in Elwood's room, they sent for Dr. Malkowski, a local practitioner who would repeat no tales where they might prove embarrassing, and he gave Gilman 2 hypodermic injections which caused him to relax in something like natural drowsiness. During the day, the patient regained consciousness at times and whispered to his newest dream disjointly to Elwood. It was a painful process, and at its very start brought out a fresh and disconcerting fact. Gilman, whose ears had so lately possessed an abnormal sensitiveness, was now stone deaf. Dr. Malkowski, summoned again in haste, told Elwood that both eardrums were ruptured as if by the impact of some stupendous sound, intense beyond all human conception or endurance. How such a sound could have been heard in the last few hours without arousing all Miskatonic Valley was more than the honest physician could say. Elwood wrote his part of a colloquy on paper, so that a fairly easy communication was maintained. Neither knew what to make of the whole chaotic business, and decided it would be better if they thought as little as possible about it. Both, though, agreed that they must leave this ancient and accursed house as soon as it could be arranged. Evening papers spoke of a police raid on some curious revelers in a ravine beyond Meadow Hill just before dawn, and mentioned that the white stone there was an object of age-long superstitious regard. Nobody had been caught, but among the scattering fugitives had been glimpsed a huge Negro. In another column, it was stated that no trace of the missing child, Ladislas Walejko, had been found. The crowning horror came that very night. Elwood would never forget it, and was forced to stay out of the college the rest of the term because of the resulting nervous breakdown. He had thought he had heard rats in the partition all the evening, but paid little attention to them. Then, long after both he and Gilman had retired, the atrocious shrieking began. Elwood jumped up, turned on the lights, and rushed over to his guest's couch. The occupant was emitting sounds of veritably inhuman nature, as if racked by some torment beyond description. He was writhing under the bedclothes, and a great red stain was beginning to appear on the blankets. Elwood scarcely dared to touch him, but gradually the screaming and writhing subsided. By this time, Dombrowski, Choinsky, Desrochers, Mazurwicz's, and the top-floor lodger were all crowding into the doorway, and the landlord had sent his wife back to telephone for Dr. Malkowski. Everybody shrieked when a large rat-like form suddenly jumped out from beneath the ensanguined bedclothes and scuttled across the floor to a fresh open hole close by. When the doctor arrived and began to pull down those frightful covers, Walter Gilman was dead. It would be barbarous to do more than suggest what had killed Gilman. There had been virtually a tunnel through his body, something had eaten his heart out. Dombrowski, frantic at the failure of his rat-poisoning efforts, cast aside all thought of his lease, and within a week had moved with all his older lodgers to a dingy but less ancient house in Walnut Street. The worst thing, for a while, was keeping Joe Mazurwick's quiet, for the brooding loomer fixer would never stay sober, and was constantly whining and muttering about spectral and terrible things. It seemed that on that last hideous night, Joe had stooped to look at the crimson rat tracks which led from Gilman's couch to the nearby hole. On the carpet, they were very indistinct, but a piece of open flooring intervened between the carpet's edge and the baseboard. There, Mazurwick had found something monstrous, or he thought he had, for no one else could quite agree with him, despite the undeniable queerness of the prints. The tracks on the flooring were certainly vastly unlike the average prints of a rat, but even Choinsky and its searchers would not admit that they were like the prints of 4 tiny human hands. The house was never rented again. As soon as Dombrowski left it, the pall of its final desolation began to descend, for people shunned it, both on account of its old reputation and because of the new foetid odor. Perhaps the ex-landlord's rat poison had worked after all, for not long after his departure, the place became a neighborhood nuisance. Health officials traced the smell to the closed spaces above and beside the eastern garret room, and agreed that the number of dead rats must be enormous. They decided, however, it was not worth their while to hew open and disinfect the long-sealed spaces, for the feuilletor would soon be over, and the locality was not one which encouraged fastidious standards. Indeed, there were always vague local tales of unexplained stenches upstairs in the witch house, just after May Eve and Hallowmas. The neighbors acquiesced in the inertia, but the feuilletor nonetheless formed an additional count against the place. Towards the last, the house was condemned as a habitation by the building inspector. Gilman's dreams and their attendant circumstances have never been explained. Elwood, whose thoughts on the entire episode are sometimes almost maddening, came back to the college next autumn and was graduated in the following June. He found the spectral gossip of the town much diminished, and it is indeed a fact that notwithstanding certain reports of a ghostly tittering in the deserted house, which lasted almost as long as the edifice itself, no fresh appearances, either of old Keziah or of Brown Jenkin, have ever been muttered since Gilman's death. It is rather fortunate that Elwood was not in Arkham in that latter year, when certain events abruptly renewed the local whispers about elder horrors. Of course, he heard about the matter afterward, and suffered untold torments of black and bewildered speculation, but even that was not as bad as actual nearness, and several possible sights would have been. In March 1931, a gale wrecked the roof and great chimney of the vacant witch house, so that a chaos of crumbling bricks, blackened moss-grown shingles, and rotting planks and timbers crashed down into the loft and broke through the floor beneath. The whole attic story was choked with debris from above, but no one took the trouble to touch the mess before the inevitable raising of the decrepit structure. The ultimate step came in the following December, and it was when Gilman's old room was cleared out by reluctant, apprehensive workmen that the gossip began. Among the rubbish which had crashed through the ancient slanting ceiling were several things which made the workmen pause and call in the police. Later, the police in turn called the coroner and several professors from the university. There were bones, badly crushed and splintered, but clearly recognizable as human. whose manifestly modern date conflicted puzzlingly with the remote period at which their only possible lurking place, the low, slant-floored loft overhead, had supposedly been sealed from all human access. The coroner's physician decided that some belonged to a small child, while certain others found, mixed with shreds of rotten brownish cloth, belonged to a rather undersized, bent female of advanced years. Careful sifting of debris also disclosed many tiny bones of rats caught in the collapse, as well as older rat bones gnawed by small fangs, in a fashion now and then highly productive of controversy and reflection. Other objects found included the mangled fragments of many books and papers, together with the yellow dust left from the total disintegration of still older books and papers. All without exception appeared to deal with black magic in its most advanced and horrible forms, and the evidently recent date of certain items still a mystery, as unsolved as that of the modern human bones. An even greater mystery is the absolute homogeneity of the crabbed, archaic writing found on a wide range of papers, whose conditions and watermarks suggest age differences of at least 150 to 200 years. To some, though the greatest mystery of all is the variety of utterly inexplicable objects whose shapes, materials, types of workmanship, and purposes baffle all conjecture, found scattered amidst the wreckage in evidently diverse states of injury. One of these things, which excited several Miskatonic professors profoundly, is a badly damaged monstrosity, plainly resembling the strange image which Gilman gave to the college museum, save that it is large, wrought of some particular bluish stone instead of metal, and possessed of a singularly angled pedestal with undecipherable hieroglyphs. Archaeologists and anthropologists are still trying to explain the bizarre designs chased on a crushed bowl of light metal, whose inner side bore ominous brownish stains when found. Foreigners, incredulous grandmothers, are equally garrulous about the modern nickel crucifix, with broken chain mixed in the rubbish and shiveringly identified by Joe Mazurkas as that which he had given poor Gilman many years before. While some believe this crucifix was dragged up to the sealed loft by rats, while others think that it must have been on the floor in some corner of Gilman's old room at the time. Still, others, including Joe himself, have theories too wild and fantastic for sober credence. When the slanting wall of Gilman's room was torn out, the once sealed triangular space between the partition and the house's north wall was found to contain much less structural debris, even in proportionate to its size, than the room itself, though it had a ghostly layer of older materials which paralyzed the wreckers with horror. In brief, the floor was a veritable ossuary of the bones of small children, some fairly modern, but others extending back in infinite graduations to a period so remote that crumbling was almost complete. On this deep, bony layer rested a knife of great size, obvious antiquity, and grotesque, ornate, and exotic design, above which the debris was piled. In the midst of this debris, wedged between a fallen plank and a cluster of cemented bricks from the ruined chimney, was an object destined to cause more bafflement, veiled fright, and open superstitious talk at Arkham than anything else discovered in the haunted and accursed building. This object was the partially crushed skeleton of a huge, diseased rat, whose abnormalities of form are still a topic of debate and source of singular reticence among the members of Miskatonic's Department of Comparative Anatomy. Very little concerning this skeleton has leaked out, but the workmen who found it whisper in shocked tones about the long, brownish hairs with which it was associated. The bones of the tiny paws, it is rumored, imply prehensile characteristics more typical of a diminutive monkey than of a rat, while the small skull, with its savage yellow fangs, is of the utmost anomalousness. appearing from certain angles like a miniature monstrously degraded parody of a human skull. The workmen crossed themselves in fright when they came upon this blasphemy, but later burned candles of gratitude in St. Stanislaus' church because of the shrill, ghostly tittering they felt they would never hear again. And so, what are you going to do when your hardship is lifted?